Turok was a huge part of my early childhood. It was the first shooter series that really hooked me, and Turok was probably the first character from a shooter that I ever looked up to. I was born in '94, so characters like Doomguy and Duke Nukem were already there, but Turok was the one that I really connected with. The character, the world, the dinosaurs, the lizard people, and that massive arsenal of insane weapons all made a huge impression on me. I can still remember running around the front yard when I was 6 or 7 years old with a collection of sticks, pretending each one was a different weapon from the game. I would lay them all out like an arsenal, grab whichever one I wanted, and run around or flopped in the pool pretending to fight lizard people. That was the age where imagination could turn your front yard into a completely different world, and Turok helped give that to me. The game and the series as a whole are still really special to me. They're tied to that part of my childhood, and they also hold memories of people that aren't here anymore, and that gives the games a bit more weight for me than just nostalgia. With a new Turok on the way, this felt like the right time to go back to the beginning, to look at what Turok was before it became a video game, who Turok actually is, what the Lost Land is, and why the whole thing is so dang foggy. So, what was Turok Dinosaur Hunter? So before Turok was running around on the N64, the character had already been around for more than 40 years. His first appearance showed up in December of 1954 in Dell's 4-color issue 596, under the title Turok Son of Stone. 4-color was basically an anthology series where Dell would give different characters and ideas their own issues. And Turok was one of those concepts that came out of all that. The first stories were written by Gaylord Du Bois and drawn by Rex Maxon. They followed Turok and Andar, two Mandan hunters living in North America before European settlement. While out hunting, they end up wandering into a cave system and eventually stumble into a hidden valley that's completely cut off from the rest of the world. Dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures are still alive there, and getting in is way easier than figuring out how to get out. That was the original foundation. Turok and Andar were basically just trying to stay alive in a place that made no sense to them. They had their bows, their tracking skills, and whatever knowledge they could rely on, which was just enough to give them a shot against creatures that really shouldn't be around anymore. A second Turok issue came out through 4-color in 1955, and then in '56, Dell turned it into a regular series. Starting at issue 3, since those first two 4-color releases were already treated as the beginning of Turok Son of Stone. The series kept going under Dell and later Gold Key for decades. Over time, Turok ended up becoming one of the more recognizable adventure characters connected to Western publishing. The overall setup stayed pretty easy to understand. Two indigenous hunters were trapped in a prehistoric valley, and each issue gave them another creature, civilization, or natural threat to deal with. That version of Turok stuck around until the early '80s. After that, it kinda went quiet for about a decade before Valiant Comics brought it back in 1992. Valiant had built a shared comic universe around characters like Magnus, Robot Fighter, and Solaire, Man of the Atom. Turok returned through that larger universe before receiving his own series, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, in '93. This is where things started to feel a lot closer to the version of Turok most of us actually remember from the game. The Hidden Valley grew into the Lost Land, a place where time had basically collapsed in on itself. People, creatures, and technology from completely different eras could all end up in the same world. That gave Valiant room to take the original dinosaur adventure and push it further into science fiction. Turok could still carry a bow and fight prehistoric animals, but now he could also run into modern soldiers, aliens, demons, advanced weapons, and dinosaurs equipped with cybernetic parts. Those enhanced creatures were called Bionosaurs, and they pretty much capture what that version of Turok was all about. A dinosaur was already a pretty solid threat on its own, but once you start strapping weapons and machinery onto it, you get something that feels a lot more over the top and perfect for an action comic or video game. Valiant's version kept Turok as just one guy's name, pretty much like the original comics. In that version, Turok is just a specific person. Acclaim changed that a little bit. In their version, Turok isn't really a name at all. It's more like a title that gets passed down through generations, kinda like the Black Panther in Marvel. Which I didn't know until I started working on this video, but it actually makes the rest of the series make a lot more sense to me. Games like 3 or the 360 PS3 release, and even the newer one all follow different characters, but they're still carrying that same mantle. So even though we're playing as Turok, we're not always the same person. If you caught the live streams, you might remember me saying I didn't love 3 because we didn't play as Turok. But really that was wrong, we're always Turok. In this game, the Turok we control is Talset. He carries that mantle handed down through the Fireseed family. And every person who holds that title is responsible for protecting the barrier between Earth and the Lost Land. That change basically let Acclaim turn Turok into more of a long-running series without being stuck just to one character. Talset could headline the first game, and then later on they could swap in another member of the family to take over. The road to the game really kicked off in 1994, when Acclaim bought Voyager Communications, the company behind Valiant Comics, for about $65 million. Acclaim was already a big name coming out of the 8-bit and 16-bit era, with games like WWF WrestleMania, NBA Jam, and The Simpsons Bart vs. the Space Mutants. A lot of their success came from licensed games, so getting their hands on a full comic catalog was a pretty big deal. It meant they suddenly had a bunch of characters and worlds they could use across games, comics, toys, whatever else they wanted, all under one roof. That technically makes Turok a licensed comic adaptation, which is kind of funny to think about now. As a kid, I never once thought of Turok as a licensed game the way you'd think of something like Batman or Spider-Man. It just felt like its own thing. But it actually is, just in a much more direct way than usual. Acclaim owned the comic publisher, published the game, then eventually owned the studio making it, so everything was basically happening under the same roof.
You run slightly faster if you forward strafe. That's why I keep turning so much.
Acclaim picked up Iguana Entertainment in 1995. The studio had already been working closely with them on games like NBA Jam, and thanks to its connection with Nintendo, it was in a great spot to start building something for the upcoming Nintendo 64. The creative director Nigel Cook, he talked about a box of Valiant comics showing up at Iguana's office after the acquisitions. The team flipped through what they had to work with, and Turok pretty quickly stood out as the best fit for the new console. And I think it's pretty easy to see why. Turok already gave them a recognizable warrior, a world packed with dinosaurs, and a built-in excuse to throw a bunch of different time periods together. The Lost Land could jump from jungle ruins to alien bases without it feeling weird. You could go from using a bow to a shotgun, and into something that basically acts like a mini-nuke, and it all just makes sense. And the enemy design had the same freedom. Human soldiers, raptors, robots, giant insects, alien creatures, and cybernetic dinosaurs all belonged in that world because the Lost Land had been built around collision. That gave Iguana an enormous amount of room to create an action game, while still pulling from the identity Valiant had established. The N64 also arrived at exactly the right point for that idea. Nintendo's new hardware was all about 3D, and developers were still figuring out what that really meant beyond the flat levels and sprite enemies we were used to in older shooters. The game was first announced for the Ultra 64, which was what Nintendo was calling the system before it officially became the Nintendo 64. By the time things really got going, Iguana had put together a pretty small team, about 18 people, and was led by David Dinsbeer. The perspective was still being decided on during those early stages. Iguana considered third-person and over-the-shoulder camera angles before settling on first-person. Cook basically said first-person just made everything feel more like a hunt, where you're both chasing something and being chased at the same time. That fits Turok really well, since the whole character is built around tracking, surviving, using weapons, and getting up close with these insanely dangerous creatures. It also gave Iguana a way to put the N64's 3D hardware right in front of the player. Dinosaurs could actually move around as full 3D models instead of just flat sprites. Human enemies even had motion capture animation, which was a really big deal at the time, and in things like lighting effects, particles, transparency, and these big open spaces, it all helped make it feel like you were actually inside this comic book world instead of just looking at it. Even the way the game moves is built around exploring that world. You can run, jump, swim, climb, and look around spaces that stretch out in multiple directions and across different heights. Iguana wanted the levels to feel organic. Cook described a common shooter layout from that period as cathedral design, where a hallway connects to a larger room followed by another hallway and another room. Turok's wilderness gave the team another direction, one built around the feeling of moving through a natural environment instead of following a rigid structure. That approach ended up becoming one of the things people remember the most about the game, even if it also led to some pretty confusing maps that we'll get into later. The team was basically building their tools on the fly while Nintendo was still figuring out parts of the hardware. Human animation could be captured from real performers, but the dinosaurs had to be animated by hand. Artists were literally moving bodies and legs frame by frame at a time when a lot of the tools developers rely on today didn't even exist yet. Everything also had to fit on an 8MB cartridge. That meant compressing assets, reducing audio quality, and finding technical solutions that allowed these large 3D spaces to run on the hardware. One of those solutions was the fog, which ended up shaping the overall feel of the game. Turok also really pushed against the image Nintendo had built around its consoles. This game had blood, these super violent death animations, massive weapons, and dinosaurs tearing into people. Cook said the team knew the violence would be the biggest point of concern with Nintendo. Nintendo was looking to expand the range of styles and genres available on the N64, so Turok was approved near the edge of what the company was willing to allow at the time. That decision helped give the system an early shooter aimed at an older audience. The N64 launched in North America in September of 1996 with a very small library, and Turok arrived in March of '97, several months before GoldenEye, so this game was carrying a lot for everyone involved. Nintendo needed software that showed the range of its new hardware. Iguana wanted to prove that a first-person shooter could feel natural on a console, and Acclaim needed its investments in Valiant and Iguana to produce something people would buy.
That's so brutal for an N64 game.
That point is especially important because Acclaim was in real financial trouble. The company had a rough time moving from the 16-bit era. Money dropped off hard in '96, and Acclaim ended up reporting a loss of about $222 million. By the time Turok was getting ready to launch, it had basically turned into one of Acclaim's best shots at getting things back on track. Analysts figured that if it sold around 1 million copies, it could pull in something like $45 million. That's a lot of pressure to put on a character who had started out in a comic more than 4 decades earlier. Still, all those pieces lined up. Acclaim had a comic property with a cool warrior in a world where they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Iguana already had a solid relationship with Nintendo and wanted to build a shooter that felt more about movement, exploring, and actually hunting things. And the N64 gave them the tech to finally make the dinosaurs, weapons, and Lost Land feel real in a way the comics just couldn't. Turok happened because Acclaim looked at this wild comic book world and thought, yeah, this could be the perfect playground for a new kind of console shooter. Hey, just real quick, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for hanging out with me for a bit. If you're enjoying it, consider subbing. There's a lot of content like this already on the channel, and there's always more coming. If you want to help the video grow, leave it a like and drop a comment. Let me know what your memories are with Turok. Did it have a big impact on you like it did for me as a kid? And also consider sharing with a friend. Also, one more quick shout out before we keep going. If you're into fitness and working towards that Turok build, check out Gain Supplements. This isn't a paid sponsorship, it's just my dad recently opened up an online shop for his store, and I just want to help get some eyes on it. He has his best-selling products available on the site, so if you want to support a new small business and help my dad out, I know he'd really appreciate you stopping by. There'll be a link down in the description for that. But that's enough of all that. Let's get back into the actual game. Once Turok finally became a video game, Iguana had to figure out what moving through the Lost Land should actually feel like. The answer was exploration. Turok gives us these huge environments and expects us to slowly work out how they connect. The campaign has a clear structure holding everything together, though each individual level still feels like a place we have to learn for ourselves. The structure starts with the hub. The game drops us directly into the hub ruins and lets us start figuring things out. Once we enter the campaign, Turok expects us to learn and adapt without much guidance. You start moving through the ruins, following paths, fighting enemies, jumping across gaps, and picking up numbered keys before we fully understand what those numbers are connected to. Then we reach the actual hub, and the campaign opens up. Several portals branch out from one central chamber, each leading into another part of the Lost Land. The entrance to the final stage sits in the middle of all that, surrounded by the routes we'll have to open up before we can reach it. Seeing all those portals changes the feel of the game for me. The opening level moves you towards one destination, the hub reveals several different areas waiting beyond it, and suddenly the Lost Land feels a lot bigger. There's an immediate sense of curiosity since we have no clue where most of those portals will take us. The portals being numbered still keeps us focused on the next level, so it never really gets confusing to follow though. Even when I opened a later portal early, I usually wanted to finish the numbered stages in order. That gives Turok a little bit of flexibility while still keeping the journey organized. The hub itself stays simple. You come back with the keys, put them into the portal, watch each one light up, and that opens the next part of the campaign. There's not much else happening in the hub. There's no NPCs to chat with or side stuff to mess around with, so it mostly just feels like a quick pit stop before heading back out. Usually, I was just ready to jump straight into the next level. The satisfaction comes from seeing the search pay off. Finding a key feels good in the moment, and completing the full set gives us another payoff when we bring everything back to the hub. Putting those keys into the locks makes progression feel physical. The portal activates in front of you and every doorway we've already opened stays active. As the campaign moves forward, the hub slowly becomes a record of how much of the Lost Land you've worked through. That gives the campaign a checklist feeling, but I mean that in a good way. We always know what we're working towards. The hub shows which portal still needs to open, and the key screen lets us see how much stuff we still have left to find in each level. Checking that screen becomes a normal part of how I played. I'd grab a key, pop open the menu, check out how many were left, and then just keep going with that number in the back of my head. That little bit of info makes the whole search feel fair. Turok's maps are big enough that missing a key would easily turn into hours of just blind wandering around. Knowing one is still out there gives you a clear reason to keep searching, while the game still leaves the actual discovery to you. Most of the required keys felt reasonably placed. The level still expects us to explore. We've got to follow different routes, poke around side areas, and just kind of pay attention to where the environment's nudging us. I never really felt like the keys were hidden in some totally unfair spot. If I saw a path branching off from the main route, I just wanted to see where it went. Finding a key was a nice bonus, but curiosity was what drove me there in the first place. There was one level where I had found every available key except for the last one, and I ran around the map like 3 or 4 times trying to figure out which path I'd missed. Eventually, I realized the final key was waiting behind the boss fight. I'd already found the portal leading into that fight and assumed it was the exit back to the hub, so what I needed to do was sitting in front of me the whole time while I ran around searching everywhere else for something that wasn't there. That moment really sums up how the game tends to work. The game keeps throwing things in front of you and just lets you figure them out. Sometimes that means hopping through a portal with no clue where it's going to drop you. Other times it's just following a path long enough to finally get why it was there in the first place. The hub and the keys give all that exploration a purpose. Then we actually get into the levels themselves, and that's where the game gets a bit harder to explain. Calling these maps mazes doesn't really do them justice. A normal maze is usually flat and straightforward. You've got walls, paths, dead ends, and a clear way through. Turok's levels go way beyond that, stretching out in every direction. Paths stack on top of each other, caves run under places we've already been, rivers slip into underwater tunnels, and bridges link up areas that didn't seem connected at all from the ground. Sometimes a path just loops back into somewhere you've already been from a weird angle you didn't see coming. Sometimes that actually helps you get your bearings. You'll end up somewhere familiar and suddenly realize how 2 areas link together. Other times it just makes things feel even weirder, because you had no clue those spots were even close to each other. The floor portals add another layer to that. We can step into one and appear somewhere that we already know. Another portal may drop us somewhere completely different with no clear sense of how this new section connects to the rest of the level. There's something kind of exciting about not knowing what's going to happen. You never really know if a portal is going to help things make more sense or just pile even more confusion onto something we've already been trying to keep straight in our heads. The sheer size of these maps really adds to that feeling. Like I said earlier, these levels can stretch across jungles, ancient ruins, caves, rivers, towers, industrial areas, underground passages. The route could keep going above you, below you, or through a section we passed earlier without even realizing it could be reached. So you start building a mental picture as you move through the world. You remember stuff like a bridge, a waterfall, a blocked path, or just some tall statue or structure sticking out of the fog. Those landmarks help you get your bearings, even while everything in between keeps twisting around. But getting turned around becomes part of the experience, in my opinion. I feel like Turok really expects you to just want to explore. Since the maps almost never point you straight to the end, you kind of have to enjoy wandering around and seeing where a path goes, even if you have no clue whether it's leading to a key, a secret, or just a room you already passed through 20 minutes ago. That whole sense of exploration really leans on the platforming too. Turok makes you jump way more than most first-person shooters from that time. You're constantly crossing narrow ledges, hopping between tiny platforms, climbing walls, riding moving pillars, and taking some pretty sketchy drops where you can barely see where you're going to land. Some of those sections really make you focus. You have to line up the jump, judge the distance, and understand where the next part of the route's going. A few of them really create that edge of your seat feeling where you're not even sure if you can make the jump. They always felt fair to me though. The jumps were pretty easy to read, and once I slowed down and actually looked at what was in front of me, I usually got what the game wanted. The tricky part was just pulling it off and trusting I'd make the distance. That's a big part of what makes platforming stand out in Turok. Movement is really tied into exploration here. Getting to a secret, grabbing your keys, or opening up a new path often just comes down to how well you can move around the world. Height also kind of changes how you read the maps. A path that looks confusing from below might make a little more sense once you get up higher. Spotting a collectible floating above you can hint at a hidden route you didn't notice before. And dropping down into a lower area might lead to somewhere you completely missed earlier. The game's always nudging you to think about what might be above or below where you're standing. Then the fog comes in and kind of messes with all that, making it harder to really understand what's going on at any given moment. The fog came from the technical limits of the N64 and the size of the environments Iguana was trying to build. Inside the game, it became part of the atmosphere. You can only see a short distance in front of you. That changes almost everything. You can't just walk into a big room and instantly get what's going on. The far walls just vanish, platforms kind of blur into the distance, and enemies don't really show up until they're right up on you. Most of the time, you just hear them first. A dinosaur starts making noises somewhere ahead, and a few seconds later, it's just charging out of the fog. Soldiers start shooting from spots you can't really see yet. The whole fight kind of just reveals itself bit by bit as you get closer. It keeps things tense because you never really know how big the fight's going to be until you're already in it. The same thing happens with the platforming. A bridge can just disappear into the fog, and you have no clue where it actually ends. Sometimes all you can see is the next platform, even if there's a whole chain of them in front of you. Big rooms can hide where you're supposed to go, so every jump kind of reveals the path bit by bit. There's also drops where you can barely tell what's on the bottom. Sometimes the only hint is the top of a tree way below you. You look down, spot that tiny bit of green through the fog, and think, well, I guess or hope there's ground somewhere under that. That limited visibility makes the world feel huge. You can tell the level keeps going way past what you actually see, so you end up having to walk through it piece by piece before it really makes sense. The fog also makes landmarks matter a lot more. You might recognize a structure once you get up close, but it's not something you can really rely on from a distance. Even after wandering around for a while, the world still feels just a bit out of reach. I recorded this video using the remaster since the modern controls and the prettier picture just would make it easier to watch. Watching me struggle to aim with the original N64 controls probably wouldn't be a great time. By default, the remaster actually turns the fog off and cranks the draw distance way up, so you could see a lot farther than you could back then. I went into the settings though and turned the fog back on, and pulled the draw distance down to get it closer to how the original game looked. I think Turok loses a lot when the fog is removed. Seeing the whole room changes everything. You can spot enemies way easier, figure out jumps without much trouble, and the map just feels smaller since you can take it in all at once. For me, the fog is a major part of the game's atmosphere. It adds a sense of mystery, isolation, tension, and it really fits with how these levels are put together. The lost land kind of just reveals itself little by little, and that slow uncovering is a big part of what it feels like to move through it. The game does give you a little guidance through how it places items though. These life force tokens are the main example of that. These floating collectibles are extremely of their time. You see one, grab it without really thinking, and just kind of know that if you pick enough up, you're going to get an extra life eventually. Turok gives you an extra life for every 100 life force tokens, which fits right in with how collectathon heavy a lot of the N64 games were. Most of the time, I was just picking them up on autopilot. Even so, where they're actually placed still ends up guiding you in these small ways. A line of tokens can nudge you along a path or guide you across a tricky jump. If one's floating above a ledge, it's basically the game saying, hey, you can get up here. Sometimes they even hint at invisible paths or secrets you'd never think to trust otherwise. Health, ammo, and other pickups work the same way. When something's sitting in a weird spot, it makes you stop and wonder, how do I get up there? Why would the game put that out over the ledge? Is there something hiding under it? The reward grabs your attention, and chasing it usually ends up teaching you something about how the level works. One of my favorite examples of this is the invisible floating path. You can see a purple life force token hanging out in the air, with nothing underneath it. Jumping towards the token lands you on a sparkling bridge that only reveals itself one step at a time, so you have to move slowly, take a step, watch the sparkles pop in. Look for the next bit of the path, and keep filling your way across something you can't fully see yet. That secret takes the same uncertainty the fog creates and turns it into a path you can actually follow. The game gives you one collectible as a hint and asks you to trust there's something out there beyond it. My other favorite secret is one that looks like a pool of lava. There's a life force token floating over this pool of lava, which already makes it feel a bit off. When you drop into it, it turns out the lava is actually just water. That hidden pool leads you into another part of the map and eventually to a Chronoscepter piece. Moments like that really show how Turok teaches you to question what you're looking at. A hazard might hide a route, or empty space might actually have a platform, and a collectible sitting somewhere weird might be the only clue you get. The level rewards you for paying attention to those details and being willing to test whatever the game puts in front of you. Temporary bonus portals adds another thing to look out for in each level. They pop up during the levels and drop you into separate rooms filled with items. The first time you find one, it feels like another unexpected piece of the lost land opening up. Each level seems to have a small set of these bonus spots. Once you've cleared those rooms, the portal can keep showing up and send you back, but it's to the same place and all the rewards are already taken. So at that point, the surprise starts to wear off. If I jumped into one and realized it was a room already finished, I usually just turned around and left. The idea still works for Turok because the portals make the levels feel unpredictable. You just really start to notice the limited variety once you've explored all the bonus areas. So the Chronoscepter gives all of this deeper exploration a bigger goal to chase. Each level has a different piece of the weapon, and I felt the need to look for them as soon as I figured out what they were. So I started paying more attention to anything that felt a little off. Weird jumps, just strange item placement, or areas that didn't really seem to fit with everything else. The keys were always kind of in the back of my mind as the thing I needed to move forward, but the Chronoscepter pieces, they gave me a reason to keep poking around even after I'd found everything I needed for the portals. A lot of those pieces are tucked way off the path you'd normally take. Some are hidden in some pretty good spots. Some want you to go for some insane jumps, or wander into an area that doesn't really seem connected to anything important. And honestly, finding one feels better than grabbing a key. The key gets you into the next level, but a Chronoscepter piece feels like proof that you really tried to explore the area. Another cool thing is each piece is actually visibly different. You can't really inspect them or spin them around in a menu or anything, but you can still tell that each pickup is a different piece of the same thing. One might look like a barrel, or a frame, or a crystal. And every time you find one, it feels like you're slowly putting the whole weapon together yourself. Seeing the piece just floating there makes that moment feel a bit bigger than the keys. Kinda like, yes, I found it. And getting to it usually means you figured out something important about the level. I definitely missed a few pieces on my first path through some of these areas, so I had to circle back later. Going back wasn't too bad though, since I already had a rough idea of how everything connected. I could speed through the parts I remembered and spend more time poking around the areas that still felt confusing. It turns into more of a focused search instead of just wandering around trying to figure things out. The completed Chronoscepter is crazy powerful, but you only get to use it a handful of times near the end of the game. For me, the main reward was just assembling it. There's just something really satisfying about finally seeing all those pieces come together after hunting them down across the whole campaign. It feels like a trophy for learning the Lost Land. So, the hub keeps everything organized, the keys give us a clear reason to keep pushing forward, and the Chronoscepter rewards anyone who wants to explore a bit further. Everything else comes down to getting a feel for how Turok's world actually works. When I think back on Turok's combat, two things always come to my mind. The huge, crazy pile of weapons, and the way enemies reacted when you used them. Those were the parts that really stuck with me from playing as a kid. Finding a minigun, trying out some weird alien gun for the first time, or watching an enemy stumble around gagging and choking on their own blood after getting hit. That's what Turok felt like. Combat is basically always happening. Enemies are scattered all over the levels, so we're constantly bumping into soldiers, dinosaurs, bugs, or whatever else is hanging out in the Lost Land. Even when things feel calm, there's usually something waiting just a little further into the fog. Everything respawns quickly. That means going back through an area still keeps you on your toes. A path we cleared earlier might already have another enemy wandering around by the time you come back through. The respawns are quick, but I'd honestly take that over running through the same empty space over and over. It keeps things feeling alive while we're hunting for the keys, the secrets, and new paths. Combat just kind of blends into how we move through the world. Most fights feel pretty fast and loose. We're always strafing, circling enemies, and firing while moving at an angle. Forward strafing makes you run a bit faster too, so it just kind of becomes how you move through the levels without thinking about it. You really notice that flow more when the bigger enemies show up. A purlin can take a lot of damage while forcing you to watch the ground for its shockwave attack. The Triceratops really needs enough space to circle it while you unload grenades or heavier weapons into them. Tighter caves and tunnels don't give you a lot of room to work with. That's where the specific enemy types really starts to matter more. The Raptoids are all about getting in your face really fast, darting forward and forcing you to react before you can really line up a shot. In open areas, it's not too bad, but in those tighter tunnels, it gets a lot more stressful. Then there's small beetles. They crawl around on the ground, swarm around your feet, and are easy to miss until they're already right up on top of you. They're not super dangerous on their own, but they mess with your movement and pull your attention down while something else might be coming at you. All those encounters feel more intentional when you notice how each enemy acts in tighter areas. The controls are quick enough where you stay moving through the world, and the enemies give you a constant reason to keep moving. The arsenal starts off pretty simple. You've got your knife, your tech bow, and a pistol you can grab pretty early if you know where to look. The bow gets way more fun once you unlock the explosive tech arrows. After that, I basically stopped using the regular arrows once I had guns. and the knife would really only come out when something small came up at you, like the beetles. The earlier weapons are just there to get you started, and after that, the arsenal just keeps getting bigger. The shotgun and assault rifle ended up doing most of the work for me. The assault rifle just felt reliable while moving around and worked great against the human enemies and smaller dinosaurs all over the levels. The shotgun, though, had a lot more punch to it. It sounds strong, it hits hard, and it just felt great against anything a few feet in front of you. There's explosive shells that you can get for it that helps a lot too, especially when enemies can soak up a lot more damage. Once I picked up the pulse rifle, that became another go-to. It fires really fast, it does a lot of damage, and it still fit the pace of Turok's combat. By that point, I was mostly swapping between those three weapons, the shotgun, assault rifle, and pulse rifle. Those are just the ones I kept going back to. Then you find the minigun, and I mean, it's a dang minigun. That pickup feels really powerful. It fires insanely fast, just shreds through the enemies, and it makes the whole arsenal just feel bigger. It's a minigun. I ended up using it quite a bit when I got it, but the ammo disappears really fast if you just hold the trigger. So it never sticks around for too long. You get that quick burst, burn through everything, and then you're back to the rest of your weapons. And honestly, that's part of what makes it fun to me. You're always picking up stronger weapons, but you never really leave the older ones behind. The grenade launcher ended up being the go-to for the bigger enemies like the Triceratops and anything else that could take a lot of damage. After that, you start picking up rocket launchers, energy weapons, and some just really weird guns. Every time a new one showed up, I always had the same reaction. Just, that gun looks crazy, I want to see how it works. Some of the alien weapons I didn't use a ton, but finding them was still fun. They just felt totally different from the normal guns, from how they looked to how they sounded and fired. The weapon wheel kind of turns into a reminder of how far we've come. We start out with a knife and bow, and by the end, Turok is hauling around enough firepower to take on dinosaurs, aliens, robots, and whatever else shows up without breaking a sweat. It follows the same feeling as the Lost Land. Pretty much anything can happen here. There were some weapons I didn't really use very much, like the particle accelerator. It can hit really hard, especially if you charge it up. But the charge time just never felt right with how fast the combat was and how much you move around. The fusion cannon is basically a mini nuke, but you barely get ammo for it. Because of that, it always felt like something I should save for a boss or some big enemy. Those weapons still help sell that feeling of power though. By that point, the arsenal was so big that not every gun needed to be a favorite. A lot of the fun just came from having all those options and knowing there was always something else to switch to. Most levels give you plenty of ammo to just have fun with everything, except for the fusion cannon. There were a few times where I ran out of ammo for a bunch of weapons at once, but it never felt like a big problem. Most of the time, you can stick with what you like and just swap when something starts running low. Boss fights take that idea and cranks it way up. Most of the bosses basically made me burn through almost everything I had. I'd start with weapons I liked, emptied them out, and then just kept scrolling through the wheel as each one ran out of ammo. Shotguns out, then the assault rifle, then the pulse rifle, grenades, rockets, whatever I still had left. By the end, I'm just grabbing anything that still has ammo and hoping it does enough damage. That creates a really fun kind of desperation. Weapons I barely touched through most of the level suddenly matter just because they still have ammo. The whole arsenal turns into one big backup plan that I'm slowly burning through while I'm trying to stay alive. Bosses are where all those weapons finally get their moment. The heavier weapons also kind of match how the enemies ramp up. For most of the game, it's just tougher versions of stuff we've already seen. Soldiers take more hits, dinosaurs don't go down as easily, and fights start needing a bit more firepower. Then, things start getting weirder near the end. Robots, aliens, more dinosaurs show up, and the whole thing leans way harder into the sci-fi side of Turok. That's where the rockets, grenades, minigun, all the weird alien stuff really starts to make sense. The enemies are bigger, way tougher at that point, and our arsenal has finally caught up to it. It just feels right, like the game's building to that moment the whole time. The real personality of the game's combat comes from how the enemies respond to damage. The death animations are super violent, especially for an N64 game from '97. One animation has an enemy stumble around after taking a hit to the neck. Blood starts shooting out, they're choking and gagging on their own blood, and they're just stumbling around until they drop. Another sends them falling to the ground where they roll and flop around in their own blood, gagging and groaning. Those animations have stayed in my memory since I was a kid. The shotgun feels more powerful because the enemies sell the impact. Explosives throw bodies through the air. The reactions complete the weapon. As a kid, I never thought very deep about any of this though. I would just watch these crazy animations happen and just think, dang, that's cool. I had never seen enemies react like that in another shooter before at the time. And it gave Turok this level of violence that just really made it stand out. All that's really why the combat stuck with me. The weapon wheel just keeps piling on bigger guns, weirder tech, and more over-the-top ways to deal damage. And the way enemies react make every weapon feel strong the second you fire it. Movement kept everything flowing, and the arsenal kept growing in a way that just felt good. And bosses eventually made us burn through everything we had in one long, messy fight. Turok gave us a bunch of weapons we actually wanted to find, and enemies that made using them stick in our heads. Turok's story is pretty straightforward. The campaigner is a warlord building up an army inside the Lost Land, pulling together anything he can control and turning it into a force big enough to take over everything around him. At the center of his plan is an ancient weapon called the Chronoscepter. Basically, it's powerful enough to tear open the barriers between different dimensions and time periods. If the campaigner gets his hands on it, he could spread his control way beyond the Lost Land. On top of that, he's got this huge focusing array that can boost the weapon's power even further. Put the two together and the idea is extremely simple. Break down the walls between worlds and pull everything under his control. Thousands of years earlier, the Chronoscepter got smashed into 8 pieces. Those pieces were scattered all over the Lost Land, so nobody could ever put it back together. Each one ended up in a different region, meaning you'd have to cross a huge chunk of the world just to collect them all. Talset heads into the campaigner's territory to grab those pieces first. His job is to keep the Chronoscepter out of the campaigner's hand, deal with the armies building up under him, and make his way to the fortress where the focusing array is being kept. That's basically what drives the whole journey. The keys and the Chronoscepter pieces are basically two sides of the same job. The keys are what let you keep moving forward, opening up new portals and pushing deeper into the Lost Land towards the campaigner. The Chronoscepter pieces are tied to the bigger problem. Grabbing them keeps the campaigner from putting the weapon back together, and gives Talset the chance to do it himself instead. In the game, rebuilding the Chronoscepter is optional though. The keys are what actually get you to the end. Story-wise, collecting all the pieces wraps things up properly, and lets Talset bring the completed Chronoscepter into the final fight. As Talset pushes further into the Lost Land, the campaigner's forces start getting a lot more advanced. By the time he reaches the stronghold, everything around him is shifted into the more high-tech side of the Lost Land. The last stretch is guarded by Thunder, a Tyrannosaurus loaded up with cybernetic armor and heavy weapons. Taking Thunder down is what actually clears the way to the campaigner himself. Talset finally comes face to face with the campaigner inside the fortress. If you manage to grab all 8 pieces, you can put the Chronoscepter back together and turn it on the guy who's been chasing it the whole time. Once the campaigner goes down, the whole place starts falling apart. Talset makes a run for it, he gets out in time, and leaves the army without its leader and the focusing array out of commission. Most of this story mostly comes from the game's manual and the basic mission setup. There aren't any conversations or cutscenes during the campaign. Instead, the game shows Talset's progress through the portals he opens, the pieces he finds, and the tougher enemies that start showing up. Because of that, the plot kinda stays in the background while we move through the Lost Land. At the end of the day, the story is straightforward. Reach the campaigner before he can break down the barriers between worlds. Turok came out on March 4th, 1997, a little over 5 months after the Nintendo 64 launched in North America. The system was still pretty new at the time, and there weren't many games out yet. Nintendo had already shown what the hardware could do with Super Mario 64, but people were still wondering what third-party developers were going to bring to the table. Turok landed right in the middle of that early period. It was a big, mature first-person shooter that came out several months before GoldenEye. At the time, there really wasn't anything else like it on the N64. Because of that, it already felt like a big deal before anyone even knew how successful it was going to be.
Can't miss the little healthies.
The overall response was pretty strong. Reviewers were impressed about how much Turok was pulling off on the new hardware. Its graphics, animation, sound, speed, and scale made it feel like one of the N64's first real technical showcases. Enemy animation had a lot of attention too. The human soldiers moved naturally, the dinosaurs felt heavy, and the over-the-top reactions to damage gave combat a level of detail that really stood out in '97. And all that lines up with what stuck in my own memory from playing it as a kid. Those enemies grabbing their wounds, stumbling around, dragging out those death animations really stuck with me. Mostly because hardly any other games were doing stuff like that at the time, at least not in a 3D world like this. The environment really helped sell the tech too. Water effects, moving surfaces, lighting, and just how much stuff was happening around you all helped make the Lost Land feel alive. The sound played a major part in that too. Animal calls, distant enemies, weapons, ambient noises, and the music all helped each area feel more alive. Even when the fog made it hard to see, you could still hear something was out there. All that put together, it gave Turok a really strong sense of immersion for the time.
Let's go that way.
The size of the game also stood out. Turok's levels felt huge compared to what most console players were used to in a shooter. They spread out in all those multiple directions, used that vertical space, and really made it feel like you were moving through a big, open environment. That sense of freedom ended up being one of the things people remembered most about the game. It also gave Turok a different kind of feeling compared to the corridor-heavy shooters that were everywhere back then. The Lost Land felt more like an actual place you were exploring instead of just a bunch of rooms set up for fights. For an early N64 game, that was pretty ambitious. It showed that a console shooter could juggle speed, exploration, vertical movement, and big 3D spaces all at once. That ambition also came with some issues though. The levels were so big that they could be tough to read at times. A lot of areas reused the same textures, so things started to look alike, and the limited visibility meant we couldn't always tell how different paths connected. The fog ended up being one of the most talked about parts of the game. It definitely added to the atmosphere and let enemies pop out of nowhere, which could be pretty tense, but at the same time, it was clearly there to hide the system's draw distance limits. And it could make getting around a bit more confusing, but again, like I said earlier, in my opinion, that's just part of the experience for Turok. First-person platforming was another thing people were split on. The jumping definitely added more depth to the environments, but judging distance from that perspective could get tricky, especially during the more precise sections. The original controls also took some getting used to. Analog movement was still pretty new for a lot of console players, especially in a first-person shooter. Some people got used to it pretty fast, while others had a harder time getting comfortable with the aiming and the movement. The game could also slow down when things got hectic. Bigger fights sometimes caused the frame rate to dip, with everything happening on screen. Those issues were pretty obvious right away. They mostly came from the same big ideas and technical ambition that made Turok stand out in the first place. The response showed that people were willing to meet the game halfway though. Turok still got strong reviews overall, even though people didn't always agree on the controls, platforming, fog, or level design. The tech grabbed everyone right away. The world felt huge in a way that was still pretty new, and the darker tone gave the N64 something its early lineup didn't really have yet. And that was really important, especially since Turok was one of the system's first big third-party releases. Nintendo's own games had already shown what the console could do, and Turok proved that an outside studio could pull off something that felt just as impressive. For Acclaim, that was exactly what they needed this project to be. Commercially, Turok ended up being a huge hit. It pulled in over $60 million worldwide in just a few months, and reportedly made up around 45% of Acclaim's revenue during that quarter it launched. The game ended up selling around 1.5 million copies. It even made it into Nintendo's Player Choice line, which was a big deal since it was the only third-party N64 game there at the time. That kind of success pretty quickly turned Turok into a full-on franchise. A comic character that had bounced around between publishers for years suddenly turned into one of the most recognizable third-party names on the N64. The gamble paid off.
God, so that thing flying?
Acclaim had put a lot into the property, the developer, and the tech behind the game. Turok ended up being a big hit, and showed there was a real audience for this kind of experience on Nintendo hardware. GoldenEye would show up later that year and end up being the game most people think of when they talk about a first-person shooter on the N64. But Turok had already kicked that door open. It showed that the console could handle a fast, mature shooter with big environments and a clear technical identity. It also proved that third-party developers could make games that stood right alongside Nintendo's own releases. The rough edges were always part of the conversation, but so was the ambition. Back in '97, Turok felt like proof that console shooters could get bigger and more immersive. That's what Turok proved. The success of Turok Dinosaur Hunter basically handed Acclaim a franchise overnight. Turok 2 Seeds of Evil showed up in '98 and went way bigger, more weapons, bigger levels, multiplayer, and a new Turok taking over the role. Then came Turok Rage Wars in '99, which leaned hard into multiplayer, followed by Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion in 2000. The series also spread out onto handhelds, kept going into comics, and popped up as action figures, dinosaur toys, and all kinds of merch. For a while, Turok was everywhere. It went from an old comic most people barely knew about to one of the names people automatically connected to the N64. That early run moved pretty fast. Each game kind of went in its own way. Turok 2 made everything bigger and leaned harder into exploration. Rage Wars went all in on multiplayer. Turok 3 pulled things in a bit and focused more on the story. Then Turok Evolution came out in 2002. Evolution pushed the series into a new console generation, and kind of reset parts of the timeline around Talset. Acclaim treated it like a pretty big deal, with a heavy marketing push and versions across multiple platforms. But by then, the name didn't really have the same momentum it did during the N64 years. The response to Evolution was kinda all over the place also, and it never really became the big hit Acclaim needed, even though I personally loved it. By that point, the series had moved around a lot, and was stepping into a market that looked pretty different from what it had been back in '97. Acclaim was already in pretty rough shape by then, They'd spent years losing money, piling on debt, and trying to find another big hit that could turn things around. In June of 2004, they lost the Turok license after missing the royalty payments. A few months later, the company filed for bankruptcy. That basically closed the book on the Turok era that started with Dinosaur Hunter. The teams, the continuity, the whole setup behind those games disappeared. The franchise was still around, but it didn't really have a home or a clear direction anymore. The series popped back up in 2008, but this time with a completely different team behind it. Propaganda Games made a new Turok for Disney's game division, rebuilding the series around a soldier named Joseph Turok. This version took place on another planet and followed a military squad fighting mercenaries and genetically engineered dinosaurs. It kept the name, the dinosaurs, and the sci-fi angle, but most of what the Acclaim games had built was left behind. The reboot got a pretty mixed response, but it sold well enough that a sequel actually started development. The sequel ended up getting cancelled during the layoffs at Propaganda Games in 2009. After that, Turok mostly faded out again. There was a smaller spin-off called Turok Escape from the Lost Valley in 2019. There wouldn't be another major release for a long time. For a series that used to be one of the biggest third-party names on Nintendo, that's a pretty long stretch of silence. Night Dive Studios eventually brought the original game back. The first Turok remaster hit PC in 2015. And after that, we got modern console versions along with remasters of Turok 2 and Turok 3. They kept the core of the original games intact, but added things like widescreen support, higher resolutions, modern controls, better performance, and a bunch of quality of life improvements like removing the fog and increasing draw distance. It made the earlier games way easier to jump back into, and like I mentioned earlier, it's what I used to record the footage for this. The original cartridges have gotten pretty expensive, and the N64 controls can be a bit rough if you're trying these for the first time, or for the first time in a long time. The remasters smoothed a lot of that out and made it way easier to actually see what the games were doing. Turok could finally be seen as more than just an old shooter people remember for the fog. People could actually get a feel for how big the levels were, mess around with the platforming, try out all the weird weapons, and see how much exploring really mattered. All the stuff that made the first game feel different was still there. That preservation mattered because Turok had kind of become hard to pin down. Some people remember the N64 games, others knew the 2008 reboot. A lot of younger people only recognized the name from conversations about old console shooters. The remasters helped bring the original version of Turok back into focus. Now, the franchise is coming back again with Turok Origins. Saber Interactive announced the game back in 2024. This time around, Origins switches things up a little bit. Well, there's a new perspective. It looks like you can do third person and first person. There's co-op, multiple Turok warriors, new abilities, and what looks like a bigger, more action-heavy feel. Saber still pointed back to the earlier games when talking about what inspired this. They called out the platforming, the big explorable maps, the dinosaurs, and all the weird alien stuff as the things that made Turok feel different. All that goes straight back to Dinosaur Hunter. The new game might take things in a different direction, but you can still see where it started. Turok works because its world can fit anything into it. That makes this a good time to come back to where it all started. The series got bigger, changed hands, disappeared for a while, and came back in a few different forms. But Dinosaur Hunter is where it really found its identity. It gave Turok a spot in gaming that the comics never really managed on their own. It also helped show that the N64 could handle first-person shooters and turn an old character into one of Acclaim's biggest names. It also shaped the version of the Lost Land that most people still picture when they hear Turok. A world hidden behind fog, a path open through keys and portals, a weapon wheel that keeps growing until Tal Set's carrying enough firepower to fight an entire army. And somewhere inside all that, a little kid running around the front yard with a pile of sticks, pretending he was a hero and saving the world. That's where Turok always lived for me. The series went through sequels, reboots, and years of silence. Those memories stayed exactly where they were. So what was Turok Dinosaur Hunter? It was a first-person trek through a comic book wilderness that asked us to pay attention, follow our curiosity, and just keep moving forward into a world we could barely see. Nearly 30 years later, that still feels like Turok.
Oh, this is the treetop village, right? Yes. Thanks, Dandy.
And that's Turok Dinosaur Hunter. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have your own special memories with this game, I hope I was able to bring some of those feelings back. Like I said at the start, this one's special to me. If you haven't yet, consider subbing. There's already a ton of content like this on the channel, and I'm always working on the next one. If you want to help this video grow, leave it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend who remembers Turok. Also want to give a huge shout out to all the channel members and to everyone who donated through super chats during the streams. As always, I really don't have words for how much I appreciate you all. And one last reminder for anybody into fitness who wants to work towards that Turok build, head over to Gain Supplements. The link's in the description. You'll be supporting a small business and helping out my dad. And he has some really good stuff over there. But seriously, thank you all for the support. You all have helped me every day to get closer to making this dream come true, and I appreciate everyone for being here. But, as always, I'll see y'all later.